for this panel, Global Health Affairs. Thank you so much. I feel quite honored, actually, to introduce this panel's moderator, Dr. Marie Berry, who is new to the Korbel staff this year and has already inspired many students with her thought-provoking courses on gender security and human rights. I've had the privilege of taking one of her courses and can say I left every course mildly depressed and overwhelmed. This is true.
You have to increase that.
Yeah. I think that's a good sign, though. I mean, human rights course, right? And overwhelmed at the realities that men, women, and non-binary, non-gender conforming people face around the world. I also, however, left each class with a new perspective and another way to consider and think deeper about these issues, and really a passion to do something about it and go out and learn more about what's happening. She's been an integral part of helping the core team focus the themes of our discussions for this symposium, and has introduced us to many of the very knowledgeable panelists we've been lucky enough to welcome to this year's symposium. So she is an assistant professor at the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies here at the University of Denver, and also an affiliate of the C. Chow Kong Center for International Security and Diplomacy. She's a political sociologist with a research focus on mass violence, gender, and development. Her current book, project, sorry, it's done. Stop right there. Oh, it's done now. It's done. It's good. Okay. So her current finished book is War, Woman, and Political Power in Rwanda and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Examines the impact of war and genocide on women's informal and formal political participation in Rwanda and Bosnia and Herzegovina. A related project critically assesses efforts to empower women in these same cases. She is also engaged in a collaborative project exploring the political logic behind market-oriented development projects in Rwanda. Her work has been published in places like Mobilization, Signs, New Political Economy, Foreign Policy, and Political Violence at a Glance. She has received several awards, including the 2015 Best Graduate Paper Award from the American Sociological Association Human Rights Section, and UCLA's Charles E. and Sue K. Young Graduate Award, the university's highest all-around award for a graduate student. She completed her PhD in sociology at UCLA in 2015. Please help me in welcoming Marie Berry.
So I feel like with that introduction, you'd think I was going to be talking about my own research, but I'm just really going to be moderating today. And you're very generous, Jessica. That was too kind. Really, it's been a pleasure working with the whole core team this year, and so it's so fun to kind of see the symposium come together. And it's been a great couple of days, and it's been selfishly very fun for me because I was able to invite some people that I haven't seen in a while to come and speak. So that's been fun. So today I'm going to introduce three really remarkable women who are going to be talking about a variety of topics related to gender and violence and vulnerability during armed conflict. Our first speaker today is Christy Edwards. She's the director of the International Humanitarian Law program at the American Red Cross, and she joins us from DC today. Christy has worked globally on international human rights, international humanitarian law, international development policy, and gender issues for over 15 years. As the director of international humanitarian law at the American Red Cross, Christy leads the organization's legal, education, public, and youth outreach efforts. And these programs reach 50,000 people directly a year with a social reach of over 18 million. She also serves as the co-chair of the American Society of International Law Women in International Law Interest Group, and directs the Women's Mentoring Program for over 200 participants worldwide. She received her JD from the Thomas Jefferson School of Law at UC San Diego, and she specialized there in international human rights. And while in San Diego, she also worked at a torture treatment center for political refugees, served as pro bono counsel for asylum seekers, and taught human rights law classes at the law school as an adjunct professor and pro bono fellow. She completed her LLM degree at Washington College of Law, specializing in international human rights and gender. So really looking forward to hear what Christy has to say. I want to just kind of introduce all the speakers at the beginning, and then I'll give them a chance to talk, and then we'll have lots of discussion. So our second speaker is Holly Neiseth-Brame, who's an assistant professor at the Ohio State University. And her research agenda is really, she has really remarkable research. She's motivated by fundamental questions of why and how atrocities occur and who commits them. She's equally interested in the process of transitional justice after atrocities, including how societies rebuild, how international actors respond to violence, and the lasting effects of mass violence. In other words, she studies multiple processes of mass violence, human rights violations, and mass crime. Her areas of expertise are the sociology of law, comparative and international sociology, peace and conflict studies, transitional justice, sociology of human rights, political sociology, and criminology. She's won something like 722 awards. I made that up. It's not her bio, but she's won millions of awards. It's not even funny. And it's really a remarkable researcher, and actually had a TED Talk that was just released today on how eradicating genocide is our responsibility. So I'll post that on social media, and I encourage all of you to check it out because it's a great talk. Our third speaker, Julie Arostegui, is a lecturer now at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies here. She's a lawyer and an international human rights advocate and gender expert with extensive experience in peace and security, combating gender-based violence, countering violent extremism, women's political participation, and many other things. She serves as an international advocate, advisor, trainer, speaker, researcher, and writer for many different sectors, including justice, civil society, politics, security, and so forth. And this quarter, she's teaching 2 classes here at the Corbell School. Most recently, before moving to the Denver area, Julie led the Women, Peace, and Security program at the Women's Action Now, or Women's Action for New Directions, also known as WAND, on the East Coast, which was working to empower women politically, both in the US as well as in Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Middle East, and North Africa. And this organization and her role in it was really working towards empowering women to be leaders on critical issues related to conflict prevention, peace building, violence against women, and so forth. She's also worked extensively with members of Congress, federal agencies, the United Nations, US Institute of Peace, and many other organizations all around the world. She holds a JD in International Human Rights Law from the University of Cincinnati College of Law, and a master's in international relations from a university in Spain that I won't butcher the name of. She did her undergraduate work at Brandeis, and we're really lucky to have Julie kind of involved now with the Corbell School. She's a really tremendous activist and expert in all things related to gender and conflict. So with that, I'd like to, again, welcome the 3 speakers, and let's start with Christy.
Thank you so much. It's a true honor to be here, and it's a pleasure to be in Denver for the first time, actually. And I will do my best to depress you all further. I think that I will make a decent effort, and my co-panelists will, I'm sure, do even better. I do want to give a small caveat. This is a lecture I usually give in about 45 minutes, so I'm going to rush it just a bit, and hopefully I'll get a time warning when I'm hitting the end of my time here, so I don't go too long. Just making sure
Now we might.
Can you all see me?
Yeah.
Okay. Ooh, excellent. Okay, great. So my lecture is going to focus a bit on women in armed conflict, and I know Holly's going to talk about the impact of war on men, which is fantastic. And I know you all probably heard a bit yesterday about women as combatants in conflict, and so I don't want to spend too much time on that, but just to note that women do have various roles within armed conflict. They can be voluntary members of the armed forces. Globally, they comprise about 2% of regular Army personnel. In the US, it's about 15%. And they can also be involuntary members of the armed forces and forced to participate as bushwives or support for various groups. They can also be members of paramilitary forces in countries like South Africa, Mozambique, El Salvador, Guatemala, Peru, Sri Lanka, Eritrea, and Palestine. Women do regularly participate as paramilitary forces. And then also women have been known to participate as suicide bombers in various, typically non-international armed conflicts or internal armed conflicts. I won't go too much further because I know you all heard a lot about it yesterday and I don't want to repeat things. But my focus today is going to be on the experiences of women as civilians in armed conflict, which is typically how people think of women during armed conflict, but I did want to just highlight that there are very many experiences that women do have during conflict. We are going to skip a video that you do not have time to watch. And today I'm going to focus on these various areas. Civilian women can be targeted because of their gender. They have quite a few very negative effects as survivors of sexual violence. The economic impact of women on women can be quite severe during armed conflict. Of course, they comprise a great number of the refugee population. There can be collateral damage based on the types of warfare they experience, and the ways in which women who are detainees experience armed conflict can cause further harm. So we'll start based on the targeting based on gender. Most people, I think, are fairly familiar that women should be protected in war, and although that is a legal norm that women should be protected in war, that is clearly not always the case, but women often take fewer precautions during armed conflict because they do think that they have that legal, or they do know that they should have that legal protection. They are caregivers for the young, the elderly members of their family, the sick and wounded. Oftentimes they will stay behind during armed conflict to protect their property if the men all leave and go out to fight, or flee because of their own persecution during the conflict. They also feel very strongly that keeping their children in school is very, very valuable. They know that that will have a greater impact on the future of their country and the future of their family by keeping their children in school. And they also want to assess when it's safe for their family to return. They have these traditional roles and responsibilities, as I just mentioned, which make them quite a bit more vulnerable in conflict. And I'm sure that Julie will talk about this further. But during peacetime, there's always levels of domestic and sexual-based violence. During armed conflict, there can be, in many places, an escalation of this violence, and for various different reasons. I know Julie's going to talk about this quite a bit more, and I do want to highlight a close colleague of mine at George Washington University, Ashlyn Swain, is publishing a book that talks about these varying levels of violence before, during, and after conflict, and the types of violence that do occur. And I highly recommend it. It would have changed my career path probably if I had known, or if I had thought about the ways in which the law only addresses a very small framework of violence during armed conflict, and not the whole range of harms that women can experience. They can also be targeted as part of ethnic cleansing, as we saw in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Many of them were raped in order to impregnate them and change the nature of the physical nature of the next generation, because it is seen as patrilineal. And women in inter-ethnic marriages or relationships are particularly vulnerable. Race, ethnicity, nationality, class, age, disability, sexuality can also affect a woman's experience in conflict. And finally, they can be targeted as a result of the political activities of male relatives or associates. If their husband or father or brother is doing something that the authorities do not like, they can be targeted specifically. They can be raped, they can be harmed, there can be significant pressure put on them so that their male family members will stop doing whatever it is that the government or the authorities do not want them to do. And I will also note that in some places, only the families of men who are killed in armed conflict are provided with legal assistance to pursue claims of compensation. So it's just another vulnerability and an issue that women and their families experience. I'll quickly go through quite a few different forms of violence that can be experienced by women and also men. I'm sure Holly will talk about that in a little bit. So rape, of course, forced sexual intercourse or sexual acts with family members, forced impregnation, pregnancy, sexual mutilation, sexual humiliation, medical experimentation on women's sexual and reproductive organs, forced abortion, forced sterilization, forced prostitution. And I want to add a quick note. We've also very recently seen with ISIS a new form of violence, which is forced contraceptive use. Because they don't want the women getting pregnant, they want to be able to rape them over and over and over again. So they force the women to use contraceptives in order to not get pregnant. So something that we haven't really seen before, and I think a lot of scholars and researchers are trying to assess now, does that constitute torture? So it's just kind of, if you're thinking about papers to write, that might be a good one. Forced exchange of sexual favors for essential items. I'll get into that in a little bit. Forced exchange of sexual favors for the return of their children who might have been taken away from them. Trafficking, pornography, forced cohabitation of marriages, again, as we've seen in ISIS or even in the DRC with bushwives. So as you can see, a lot of very interesting, creative, and it seems like even more creative every day, ways in which women and also men and boys can experience sexual violence during armed conflict. This, of course, has a very significant effect on the survivors of sexual violence. In their communities, they face quite a bit of ostracism because the violence is, of course, seen as a very shameful act that has taken away perhaps their virginity or their honor within the society. This causes quite a bit of shame. The comfort women after World War II, once they started speaking about this, they talked about the overwhelming shame and even the levels of, and I'll mention this in a minute, but that shame led to increased suicide rates too, because they just felt like their identity had been taken. Of course, divorce, men who have left their wives or women who leave their husbands because of the sexual violence or abandonment if they're not actually married. The financial support born of children born of rape is often significant, especially in a wartime period when resources are scarce. Having another mouth to feed or a child to educate is another quite additional expense, and particularly if you're not thrilled about having that child in the first place, it can be fairly extreme. The risk of HIV and AIDS, of course, is also quite high, and as we've seen in some conflicts, I believe it was in Rwanda, where the perpetrators actually specifically raped women in order to give them HIV and AIDS. As I mentioned, increased suicide rates, and also the level of medical and psychological care for the survivors is very, very low compared with the need out there. And that assumes that people will even seek medical or psychological care to begin with. Because again, as many of these traditional communities, they don't feel even comfortable admitting that something has happened to them, because then they will face community-wide or family ostracism and that shame of it being their fault or something that's because of something that's been done to them. Moving on to the economic impact that women experience. Of course, during an armed conflict, access to supplies of food, water, and medicine are quite low. The maintenance of property can be quite extreme on women. They have to maintain the crops, feed animals, harvest and prepare food. And if they've shared that responsibility with male members of the household, and it's now basically all on them or them and small children, it can be pretty significant. The food provision for their families, they have additional mouths to feed, extended family that's fled from conflict from other areas or towns that come to stay with them, the children born of sexual violence. Often they have responsibility for military ordering. The military shows up, says you have to feed and house us, and they have to, or else they can face severe consequences. Many women do move, and because of this move from the purely private area of their home to the public sphere, whether they're gathering and selling crops or taking over the family business, some women do find it quite empowering during this time, because they are taking on additional responsibilities and finding that they do it really well during that period of time. But when the conflict ends or men come home and they are expected to go back to those traditional roles, that can cause additional conflict within the family because they don't want to necessarily just go back and be solely within the private sphere. Lack of documentation for property ownership. I'm sure you've probably all studied many countries around the world that do not allow women to own property, or the property is only held in the man's name. So if a man leaves and goes off to war, they don't necessarily own the title to their land. If the man dies, or if there's no proof of death, having inheritance of that land can be quite tricky. There are many extended family members that will come and kick a widow and her children out of the family home or the family property once the male head of household is no longer around to protect them. They also have no entitlement to social assistance or pensions. In many countries, women do not have the right to sign a contract. So if they want to start a business or apply for a loan from a bank, they can't do it unless they have a male signature. It's a pretty big surprise to me that in many countries, even Lebanon, you can't even open a bank account for your child unless the father also co-signs. So pretty restrictive legal restrictions on women in these areas. So again, as I mentioned, forced eviction. Inflation, when resources are scarce, inflation goes up, and the cost of household goods is usually one of the first things to go up, and because women are usually the ones buying those goods, that negatively impacts the women first. And so women's possessions are typically sold first to meet the basic needs of the family. Sanctions, again, often have a fairly significant effect on household items and goods, which women's financial contributions usually go to purchase. Talk a little bit about refugees. Women are the majority of the world's refugees and internally displaced persons. The estimate is between 70 and 80% of all refugees are women and children. They do rely fairly heavily on local populations or assistance from NGOs for survivors, and I'm sure you've all seen the news talking about the Syrian refugees coming to Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, and then of course their migration over to Europe, and even those being now returned back to Turkey, where they are not allowed to have jobs or be a part of the formal economy. There's a high risk of sexual violence and injuries from landmines when searching for water, food, firewood, and traditional medicines. And often the refugee camp authorities will only give paperwork or documentation or assistance to the male heads of households, and so female heads of households who are traveling alone with children or extended family members that might want to go get a ration card or food or supplies. They're overlooked, or their needs are overlooked, or they're not even considered when doing consultations with the populations about what the community needs are. They can be forced to trade sex for food, safety, shelter, documentation, etc. And I would also note that there are inadequate protections for gender-based violence within asylum law, and I'm sure that we'll get into that in a little bit. And finally, lack of adequate access to medical care. Again, as we've seen, there's a lot of violence perpetuated against women, and the lack of doctors, medical facilities, etc. This can have pretty significant effects on them long term. Collateral damage. Modern warfare and strategies and indiscriminate weapons such as landmines and chemical weapons have really negative effects on women. Landmines, because women have lower body mass, they might be out in the fields and so more exposed to landmines. They do receive less medical treatment than men, and this prevents refugees, again, mostly who are women, from returning to their homes or land. Oh, sorry. Chemical weapons, this has caused abortions due to congenitally defective fetuses, or caused sterilization, where women are not able to have children because of their exposure to chemical weapons. Finally, for detainees, there are very few detention facilities for women, mostly because most detainees are men. They typically are built with men in mind. And so the women's facilities are typically located very far away from city centers, which leads to a lack of material and emotional support from family, because often they don't provide actual food or clothing within the detention facilities. They rely on family members to provide these things. If children are detained with their mothers, sometimes threats against children are used to get information or get cooperation. And there have been instances of sexual violence and gender-specific torture, such as pregnant women subjected to electrical shocks, body searches and vaginal examinations, rape and forced intercourse, etc. And of course, forced labor to support women combatants. There are some legal protections for women in international humanitarian law, in an international armed conflict. Female prisoners of war are supposed to be separated from male prisoners of war and supervised by female guards. For civilians, they are entitled to humane treatment, respect for life. They should be especially protected against any attack on their honor, enforced prostitution, indecent assault, and again, outrages upon personal dignity, in particular humiliating and degrading treatment, rape, and forced prostitution, and any form of indecent assault are forbidden. Again, indecent assault is mentioned. The reason why I find this particularly significant is that these provisions were drafted in 1949 and 1977, and the language and the way we think about protection for women in armed conflict is very much reflected, I think, in the way that these protections are phrased. And so specifically linking sexual violence and honor makes it seem that the legal protections is less about the physical protection of women and more about the social value of women's chastity. And using terms like indecency and honor fails to recognize the brutal nature of rape or other forms of sexual violence, and uses a valuated term to warrant legal protection rather than the entity of the woman herself, and embodies the notion of women as property. So I'm way out of time, and I apologize for going super fast, but I'm sure we'll have time for questions at the end, so thanks.
All right, good morning, everyone. Bear with me for a moment. This is a new project, and I don't usually talk with notes, so I might be a bit awkward trying to see them and work this. But thank you so much for having me here. It's always great to be invited to conferences, and especially when the organizers are so organized. Just fantastic, and I can't say that enough, and it's so appreciated as a speaker when things are so well done, so thank you so much. So this is part of a newer project. As was mentioned, I study genocide and mass violence. A lot of what I do focuses on forecasting genocide, on understanding how genocide unfolds at local levels, and on how societies rebuild in the aftermath. And this is part of a collaborative project with collaborators at Ohio State, or the Ohio State University, and at the University of Minnesota, in which we're trying to understand the many different ways that genocide and many forms of mass atrocity are gendered. So in this project, we're looking at gender-based violence against men, women, boys, and girls. To complement the talk on women and girls, I thought I would focus specifically on men and boys during the talk today. Though I should add the caveat, of course, that this in no way needs to detract from the violence against women and girls, as they often bear the brunt of many forms of gender-based violence during mass atrocity. As an academic, I would be remiss if I did talk just a little bit about data, and then I'll move on for the rest of the talk, and I won't talk too much about data. But we're using a case study of Darfur, which I'll tell you a bit more about in a moment. And our data come from the US government, actually. So in 2004, the US government completed the Atrocities Documentation Survey. I don't know if you've heard of that at all. It was essentially a way to try to understand the violence that was unfolding in Darfur. So we sent teams of trained interviewers as well as translators to refugee camps and informal settlements in Chad, to 22 to be exact. And they interviewed well over 1,000 refugees who were chosen randomly through a stratified sample, and I'm happy to talk more about that and geek out about what that means. But essentially the main point is that they were asked about the types of violence that they experienced, but also that they witnessed and that they heard about. And the broader point was to try to better understand the many forms of violence that have been unfolding in Darfur. This violence still continues today, as I'll talk about in a moment, but since this was completed in 2004, this is really a look at the earlier forms of the violence. A little bit on Darfur then. As I mentioned, this violence really ramped up in 2003, and specifically in February and in April of 2003, armed groups that were essentially working against the government attacked government sites in Darfur. So they attacked a military barracks as well as an airplane hangar. And after this is really when violence essentially ramped up against members of these groups.
So the government, as well as members of militias known as the Janjaweed, began systematically attacking certain villages. And these villages happen to be the villages that are mostly comprised of the ethnic groups that are members of these groups that then attacked the government. So this involves the Fur, the Zagawa, and the Mausolete people, though it also involves other people who are typically seen as African. This violence has been going on for a really long time. It's really complex. So estimates of the people who have been killed are frankly terrible, and we really don't know. A lot of estimates typically say around 400,000, but they've been saying that for the last 5 years. There are also estimates of those displaced, seriously in the millions, often 2 to 3 million. But again, we often don't know, and actually understanding the numbers during mass violence can be very, very tricky. The main point, though, is that this violence still continues to unfold. It's a very complex episode of mass violence that again, I'm happy to talk a bit more about afterward as well. So in our project, we're trying to understand the many forms that mass violence can be gendered. So again, we're looking at gender-based violence. And I know we've talked about this a little bit, but just as a reminder of what this is, as was mentioned, often in early scholarship or in law, conceptions of gender-based violence were pretty limited. Often it was seen as rape, typically defined as penetration, and not much more than that. As you see up here, though, it actually includes a very broad range of actions that are sexual and non-sexual, like sex-selective killing, which I'll talk about in a moment. Most of the research has focused on women and girls, rightfully so, and much more recently, people have also been paying attention to men and boys, and the victimization against men and boys during episodes of mass violence. So this work has been pioneered by people like Charlie Carpenter, others that I list up here, and we are drawing upon their work to try to theorize how this violence unfolds. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit, if I have time, about a project where we're really trying to understand violence against women and men and girls and boys at the same time, and really trying to understand why this is taking place and how it's gendered. So for this project in particular, we're thinking about how men become emasculated. And we're drawing on the work of Sabuka Marin, who essentially suggests that emasculation is a way that people can assert power. So emasculation, or emasculate, comes from the Latin for emasculare, if I say that correctly at all, which essentially is Latin for diminutive male. So it can sometimes mean something biological, like actually castrating someone. It can also essentially mean depriving someone of power or valor, as well as feminizing them in some way. And this is something that is culturally specific. So as I'm sure you've learned about in classes or in other settings, masculinity and femininity is something that is certainly culturally specific. It's not something that is universal. In Darfur in particular, men are typically seen as those in power and as those who are supposed to protect their families and protect their villages. So I have a figure up here. I won't talk too much about it, but again, I'm happy to talk more about it later. Essentially, gender prescriptives in Sudan have really come from the state. Sudan has been engaging in nation building since the 1950s, and nation building often engages gender. So in this case, there's been much discussion of what it means to be an ideal man, and often an ideal Muslim man, and an ideal woman in this case. This really ramped up in 1989 when President Omar al-Bashir took power and has remained in power. And throughout the 1990s, there were many different policies that were explicitly stating what it meant to be a man in these contexts. And as I mentioned, this is typically someone who's supposed to be in power and provide for the family both financially, but also through protection of the family as well as the broader community. So in this project, we're essentially trying to look at how men are being essentially emasculated in Darfur. And I'm going to focus on this, but I'm happy again to go back and talk more about this figure and what it means later. In doing this, we're looking at 4 key types of emasculation. There are many more than this, and as an academic, you'll probably hear me saying all kinds of caveats. A couple of caveats here is we're talking about 4. This doesn't mean that there aren't other forms. So these are the 4 that I'm going to talk about, and I'll go through them one by one. But they're not mutually exclusive, they're also not exhaustive. So this basically means that there are other forms of emasculation taking place, and that they can also occur concurrently. So often this is taking place at the same time. We should also note that through emasculation, we don't necessarily know that the people who are committing the violence are trying to emasculate these men. We are not interviewing them. This is something that we believe is taking place more on a group level. The same for the people who are actually being emasculated. Sometimes in their interviews with the ADS, they did say essentially that things were emasculating in different words. Other times they don't say this, so this is often us thinking about what is taking place. And again, thinking about this as a group level and really as the emasculation of the victim groups in Darfur. The first then is homosexualization. And there are many forms of homosexualization, but we focus more specifically on rape. And rape against men has been very, very prevalent in Darfur. So one respondent shared, 4 men were raped in the village. These men were then shot and killed. After they killed the men, they raped them anally with sticks. So rape actually often preceded or took place after mass murder, and it was typically committed by groups of men against other groups of men. So it often wasn't a one-to-one situation, but often very similar to gang rape situations. It was typically done with other types of objects, so often gun barrels, twigs, really anything that could be found. In Darfur, rape can be very, very emasculating. So the heterosexual man has been seen as dominant. Homosexuality is typically seen as something that really brings someone to be a lesser person, as unfortunate as that sounds. So in this case, this is homosexualizing these men. This is actually a crime that can be seen as punishable by death. So that is the third offense. People actually can be punished with death with this. I also have up here that they target elderly leaders in particular. We rarely, 5 minutes, oh my gosh. So we rarely see this targeting boys in particular. This is often because boys are not sexual beings, and it's actually really targeting the elderly men. We believe this is because these often hold very powerful roles within the community, and this is a particular way to take away this power. 5 minutes, okay. I'm gonna go really fast, and I apologize for that.
1 minute.
Oh, okay, perfect. All right, so the second mechanism that we're looking at is feminization. So feminization broadly is really about taking away, devalorizing men, taking away their power, and also giving them attributes that are typically seen as associated with women. So as I've mentioned a few times now, most anthropological studies of Darfur tend to look at men as those who hold power, as those who are supposed to protect their families. In this case, men are often rendered powerless, and they're often not able to protect their families or their communities. And this really came up time and time again in the interviews. So one man explained, I ran away because I couldn't stand to see the women hurt in the family. The men gathered in the yard to try to defend them. The soldiers shot them. The men had nothing to protect the village. So a lot of these men talked time and time again about how they just had to watch, and they could not do anything. And often the people who are perpetrating the violence are very aware of this. So often they would talk about how they would hear themselves being taunted by things like, come and get your girls. The third one then is genital harm. And this is actually very, very, very pronounced, and it came up time and time again through the ADS interviews with people who have fled to Chad. Genital harm has often been a way that has influenced individuals and been a way to demean individuals, and again, particularly in this context. So just to give you one example, a respondent reported, for 7 days, I was detained and tortured by government soldiers. I was made to lie on my back with my hands and ankles tied, and they would stomp on my thighs and kick me in the genitals. Later, he talked about how he had sexual problems ever since then and how this was very embarrassing for him. Much of this actually involves the pronounced targeting of the penis, and this is something that's not new at all. So if you look back in history, through conquests and invasions, for example, Persian armies would often chop off the penises of people that they conquered, put them on plates, really as a way to show the conquership. And the very same thing is taking place in Darfur. So again, there are many examples of these very same things occurring. Finally then, the last mechanism that I'll talk about very briefly is sex-selective killing, and this is taking place in Darfur as well. So a respondent explained, I saw 5 pregnant women have their stomachs ripped open. The soldiers removed the fetuses. If they were male, they destroyed the fetus by smashing it on the ground. Another respondent, and actually many respondents, said that the soldiers and members of the Janjaweed actually screamed things as they were engaging in these actions. So one said, I am Omar al-Bashir, and I have orders to take everything. Kill the men and capture the women. Make them slaves. We believe that this form of gender-based violence is rooted in conceptions of men as fighters and as protectors. So one of the respondents actually said it perfectly, as he shared that someone said, it seemed they were targeting the men and boys because I heard them say, a puppy can become a dog. It's also worth noting that, as in Bosnia, ethnicity is patrilineal in Darfur, so often many people suggest that this is also a way to target particular ethnic groups through this type of killing. So I imagine I'm almost out of time, but I did want to note, while I'm focusing broadly on gender throughout this talk, intersectionality becomes very important. So as you heard, ethnicity is certainly very much wrapped up in this violence, and gender doesn't operate in a vacuum. As you heard when I talked about homosexualization, for example, age becomes very important here, as we didn't see this mechanism occurring against people who were less than 15, and we saw it particularly targeting individuals who were elderly or held important roles within the community. So the broader point is that as we look at gender, we also have to be conscious of the different ways that other identities sort of overlap to produce certain social situations. I have a minute, so I'm just gonna, I'll just put the conclusions up there, and I'll actually stop on time. But thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to talking with you afterward.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you so much to Cord for having me, and definitely a big thank you to Dr. Berry, because it's really because of her that I've been getting involved here at DU, and it's been great. I'm really impressed with the students here. Everybody's very engaged and involved, so it's really a great place to be. Thank you also to Christy and Holly. I learned a lot from both of your presentations. While they were pretty depressing, but that's what we deal with in our field, right? But hopefully my talk maybe will give a little bit of hope, because I'm going to talk a little bit about the responses that we've seen at the international, national, and also local levels. And of course, we still have issues, but you know, there's some hope. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of the framework that we now have around women, peace, and security, or gender, peace, and security, which I think is now becoming more accurate of a term. But I think we all know that women have been very involved in peace movements and human rights movements for a long time throughout history. But it's really in the 1990s, when we were seeing the conflicts in Bosnia and Rwanda, as we've heard a little bit about, it was really coming to light how the effects of these conflicts on women. And it's not that we hadn't seen sexual violence in wars before. Certainly in World War II and throughout history, we've seen massive rapes and gender-based violence. But it's really coming to the attention of people throughout the world, what was happening in Bosnia, what was happening during the genocide in Rwanda to women, and also a growing need to recognize that women need to be a part of all processes. So if we're combating gender-based violence and promoting rights and rebuilding countries after conflict, women have to be a part of that. We have to have everybody at the table. So we now have an international framework, and I'll just briefly talk about the UN Security Council resolution. So in 2000, and I should back up and say this is really came about as a result of the advocacy of women's groups around the world in countries that have been affected by conflict. We heard Hillary Clinton in 1995 at the Beijing Conference on Women say very famously that women's rights are human rights. And out of Beijing came a declaration that for the first time talked about the effects of conflict on women. And in the years after that, we saw a lot of advocacy around this. And finally, in 2000, the UN Security Council passed a landmark resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, which I always know, really importantly, it calls on all parties at all times to respect international law. And in my work and my advocacy, that's very important to remind people, because these are Security Council resolutions, which there's debate whether they're binding or not, but we're talking about international laws that are binding, some of which we've heard about: international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Genocide Convention, the Convention Against Torture, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which I will talk about in a few minutes, things like the Human Trafficking Protocol, and the Beijing Declaration. And we have, you can see here, the four, as we call them, pillars of the framework, which is looking at participation, protection, prevention, and gender mainstreaming. And just to talk briefly about what these pillars mean. So participation means increasing the participation of women at all levels of decision making, including things like national, regional, and international institutions, in mechanisms for the prevention, management, and resolution of conflict, in peace negotiations, and in peace operations as soldiers, as police, and civilians, because women are included in all of these groups. So we need to have their representation. And then protection. So this involves promoting the protection of women and girls, and men and boys now are increasingly included in the discourse, as they should be. But the protection from sexual and gender-based violence, especially in humanitarian situations, such as the design of refugee and IDP camps. Christy talked about how these issues often are overlooked. The training of military and police, who are tasked with the protection of citizens, and unfortunately often are also the perpetrators of violence against citizens. The investigation of prosecution of abuses by peacekeepers and humanitarian workers, as I just mentioned, and also command responsibility and disciplinary measures for military accountability, because impunity is a huge issue, so people need to be held accountable. Prevention, and I think, for me, this is one of the really critical pillars, and it's critical in all work, I think, because so much of what we do is after the fact, and it's putting Band-Aids on things. But we really need to get at the prevention of abuses and the prevention of conflict. So this pillar looks at improving the prevention of violence against women and gender-based violence, including by persecuting perpetrators, strengthening national legal systems. So we really need to have laws in place and systems that will not permit these kind of abuses, and inclusion in military and security policies. Gender mainstreaming, which really considers gender and the needs of women and men in all aspects of conflict prevention, peace negotiations, peacekeeping, peace building, humanitarian response, and post-conflict reconstruction and governance. So we really need to have that gender lens in all points in these processes. Just a few more on gender mainstreaming, things like appointing gender advisors in missions, the training and sensitization of all personnel, and also incorporating women's organizations and civil society into planning, because these are really, they bring critical aspects to the table, so we need to include these groups as well. And you can see here, so that was the original resolution in 2000, and since then we've had 7 more. There are a total of 8. I actually need to put the newest one on there. So in 2008, 2009, there was a recognition that, okay, so we've said these things are important, but sexual violence is still occurring at unacceptable levels. So there are additional resolutions that look more in detail at sexual violence and actions that the UN and the states and parties should take in order to prevent sexual violence. 2106, yeah, there it is. In 2013, we had another round of resolutions. So 2106 reiterates sexual violence and conflict, and it calls on the UN, states, donors, and all parties to take additional steps to combat gender-based violence. And 2122 gives stronger measures for women's participation, and notably included access to sexual and reproductive services for pregnancies due to rape and conflict, and that was a pretty big step that was taken there. And the one that I need to add on there was just passed by the Security Council in October of last year, after the 15th anniversary of the original resolution 1325 and a high-level global review that had occurred. And that makes additional commitments after the review. And just to briefly also say that the U.S. has a national action plan on women's peace and security under 1320. What? This must be way too much fun. Countries have been urged to create their own national action plans and policies, so the U.S. does have one, and we've been working for a few years now on codifying that into law through the Women, Peace and Security Act. And just to note some additional U.S. policies, the U.S. strategy to combat violence against women and the U.S. global strategy to empower adolescent girls both deal with gender-based violence. And AVAWA, the International Violence Against Women Act, is also another piece of legislation that groups have been working on for several years to combat gender-based violence both against men and women. Okay, so let me talk quickly about the development of international criminal law. I brought notes, so I would try to stay on time. The identification of sexual violence during armed conflict as a war crime began with the work of international courts established again during the 1990s as the widespread use of sexual violence came to the attention of the international community. So the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia at The Hague and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in Tanzania were established by the UN Security Council in 1993 and 1994 respectively to address these horrific crimes that had occurred during the conflicts in those countries. The Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, or ICTY, was the first war crimes tribunal since the Nuremberg trials after World War II, and it was the first to include the prosecution of sexual violence as a war crime, a crime against humanity and genocide, and including the first trial ever for the rape of men. And the Rwanda Tribunal's landmark Akayesu case in 1998 recognized rape as a weapon of war. That was the first case, the first conviction that we had when it found the mayor, John Paul Akayesu, guilty of genocide and war crimes against humanity, including rape. So the experience with these courts gave way to the development of an international criminal tribunal, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which is based in The Hague, and the Rome Statute, which is the treaty that establishes the criminal court, looks at genocide, which is a deliberate destruction of an ethnic, racial, religious, or national group, and it can include things like forced sterilization and rape when it's meant to cause the destruction of a group. Crimes against humanity, which include rape and other forms of sexual violence, war crimes also. So we have these, these three major crimes now that include sexual violence. And last month we actually saw the first convictions for crime of sexual violence at the International Criminal Court when the former vice president of the DRC was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity for sexual violence committed in the Central African Republic under his command. So the work of these tribunals has been really key in developing international law and additional advocacy tools in this area, and it's certainly flawed. But again, to give some hope, it's there are definitely steps in the right direction, and I think have been great tools for advocates to use. Just briefly, some work at the national level in some areas that I've worked in. I did work in Uganda, where using 1325 and national law and obligations, a women's group advocated for passage of 4 new laws. And Uganda had gone through a 20-year conflict, especially in the northern part of the country. And they used these obligations to be able to pass laws related to gender-based violence, including a Domestic Violence Act, prohibitions of female genital mutilation. They passed an Anti-Trafficking Act, and they also have an ICC Act, which creates a system in the national courts for them to hear cases of war crimes, crimes against humanity in their national courts, and that includes sexual violence. And there are countries around the world that are working to pass national action plans, like the U.S. has. Iraq and Afghanistan are some notable countries where civil society and women's groups have really been able to advocate for these laws and policies to come into effect. I know I'm nearing the end of my time, so I just also wanted to quickly briefly talk about some of the innovative work that I've seen groups doing on the ground. You know, we talk about these legal frameworks, but critical to all of this is working with cultures on the ground, because we can have frameworks and laws in place, but if they're not being implemented, then they're really not, they're just on the books. And it's really working with culture and society to change you know, the discrimination, the social behavior that has allowed these violations to exist. So for instance, in Uganda, the Association of Women Lawyers has been working in the north, especially with traditional leaders, to look at issues of gender-based violence in the community and the cultural responses. In you know, areas like this, we have disputes that are decided by local leaders, elders, and religious leaders, and you know, sitting in the office of the head of the Choli, which is the group of traditional and religious leaders there, and I said to him, I said, you know, because they've really been instrumental there in working with their communities, and I asked him, you know, what's kind of the magic here, because you know, it's such a challenge around the world to deal with cultures and strict religious ideologies in different countries. And he said, you know, after the war, this was in northern Uganda, after the conflict, we really had no choice. There were so many widows and there were so many cases of gender-based violence coming to us that we really had to look at how we were going to deal with this. So I have more stories, but I'll save those. And just to say again that you know, we face many, many challenges. I think there's still, you know, despite all these the frameworks and the laws, there's still, we need more outrage and we need more action, because there are too many things that continue to happen. So we will continue to work on it. Thank you.
Thank you for 3 really fascinating presentations, and sorry for keeping you to your time. I want to start off by asking a question to all 3 of you, and then open it up to questions from the crowd. And my question, you know, I think is relevant to all 3 of you, but maybe specifically to Julie and Christy a little bit more. And it's about the way in which the legal frameworks and the way in which we think about conflict as temporally bounded, as something that starts and stops on a given date. And when we talk about gender-based violence, we oftentimes talk about legal frameworks and we talk about addressing issues of gender-based violence within these sort of temporal parameters, right? What I want to ask you, you know, is from your own experiences and the work you've done, how in many ways is violence not over when it's over, right? And how does gender-based violence in some ways, you know, reflect a continuation of the dynamics of, say, more political forms of violence in individual people's lives, sometimes decades and even generations after the kind of period of armed conflict has ended? What